friends. It's my pleasure to introduce the two speakers this morning. I think we're going to get the counter discourse today, looking at the abstracts. The first speaker is Neil Selwyn. He's a professor at the Faculty of Education at Monash University. His writing and research focus on education, technology and sociology, and recent books include Education in the Digital World and Schools and Schooling in the Digital Age.
Excellent, thanks. Well, I'd like to thank all the organisers. Rodney's judging a poetry competition. I'd like to thank him, Christoph and Alice and everyone else for sorting out. It's an excellent sort of 3 days. It's been really, really interesting for me because this is the first time I've ever been in a university English faculty in my life. I stopped doing English when I was 15. So I don't really feel like I belong, I feel like a fraud. So it's really nice to be here. I mean, I do stuff on digital stuff. I don't really see myself as a kind of digital literacies person. So what I wanted to do in this talk was maybe just give a bit more of a macro focus on things as opposed to the micro focus that we've had over the last couple of days. Hopefully we can kind of go back down to the micro. And I guess, and again, I don't see myself as a discourse person either, but I guess if this fits into what the theme of the conference is about the big D discourses rather than little d discourses. And I'm also interested in education as opposed to learning. So obviously learning is a part of that, but I'm interested in the way that learning is organised and arranged and configured and institutionalised and provided. I kind of wanted to just talk about those 3 things. So I think, yeah, obviously, digital technology we've kind of established is a big deal in all areas of life, all areas of society. It's been really interesting to talk about how technology is absorbed into everyday life. We've seen how technology is absorbed into our bodies, how it's absorbed into what we, how we cook food, how we go on holiday, how we take our phone. It's really, really interesting. But it also requires careful analysis. I think that's a key theme that's come from the talk so far. And I think education is a particularly potent case of really kind of carefully analysing the digital and digital practices. So I think there's a significant but uneasy relationship between education and digital technology, and there's long been a kind of very kind of uneasy balance. And I think it's an area of the digital that really needs kind of critical analysis and needs to be approached in problematic terms. So I'm really interested in this idea of problematizing education and technology, and seeing it kind of as a site of struggle and a site of conflict across a number of fronts. And I think the key questions that need to be asked about education and the digital are the main political questions that need to be asked about education. So what is education? What is it for? What should education be? And that's kind of how I wanted to think about education and technology. So I'm thinking about it in terms of broader issues of power and control and conflict and resistance and all of these kind of big D concerns. Now there is a niche tradition of looking at discourses of education and technology, I mean, particularly in the 80s and in the early 90s. So we know people like Ivor Goodson, for example, Mike Blackwell, David Noble, Neil Poster, Larry Cuban, really kind of rich tradition of critical analysis of technology education. It just seems to dwindle, people seem to have got bored of it. I think the internet came along and it was so spectacular. Sometimes I do blank screens.
Oh, you're doing this?
Oh yeah, I do blank screens sometimes.
You make it go up with it.
Yeah, if I want to distract you from what I'm saying, then I'll do that. Oh, it's got my that's very impressive. Sorry, that's yes, I mean there is this kind of niche tradition of looking at discourses of education and technology, but they kind of just dwindled away, and I think the internet came along the spectacular of Web 2, and people just kind of got bored. So I'm really interested in revisiting this idea of discourses of education and technology in 2013. So I mean there's 3 questions that I would ask. First of all, how is education technology being constructed in political, professional, academic, commercial, discursive arenas? It's really interesting to see how different interest groups and different agendas and different things are talking about education technology. And what are the wider philosophies and priorities and intentions that are actually shaping the drive towards digitising education? And last of all, I think this is the most important thing, how can we understand what's been gained, or the potential gains, and the potential losses as well, of what's being actually proposed? And that's kind of what I've tried to do in the paper, in the chapter, just to look at education and technology from those 3 questions. So, we're going to get the screen down again, or are we going to do this freeform?
No, because it is restarting.
Okay.
It got some problem with
That's cool.
We are so sorry about that.
No, we'll survive.
my slides again.
I'm very low tech.
Been working on
Let me start the system.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll press on. I think on the face of it, 2013 is completely different to those 80s and 90s people that I'm talking about. So in some ways, if Noble and Cuban and everyone came around today, you could argue that you've got a complete fresh landscape to be dealing with. So we've got social media. This is one of the big game changers of the last 5 years. Wireless connectivity, for example. We've got the cloud and all kind of data storage and things that are associated with that. We've got personalised and portable computing. I think one of the big kind of changes from 2013 to kind of 1993 is the idea of the personalised portable computing device, the smartphones and the tablets. So in some ways, you could argue that we need to kind of completely look at education technology from a completely different way from 20 years ago. But I think one of the arguments I want to advance is that actually there's quite a lot the same in 2013 as there was maybe 20 years ago, maybe even 30 years ago. So even though we've got this landscape which looks very different, my argument is that in fact it's a lot that is the same. However, if you look at the discourse, there's a completely new, fresh set of labels, terms, buzzwords, jargon, edtech speak. Edtech speak has completely changed in the last 10 years. And a lot of it we've heard over the last few days. So Alana's talking about 21st century skills. You couldn't have gone anywhere over the last 5 years without hearing about 21st century skills in the edtech universe. School of One, Jim was talking about Thursday, the iPad for every child, the MOOC we're going to hear about in the next talk, flipped classroom, unschooling, all of these things are kind of common discourse now in education and technology circles. And it's really interesting to kind of unpack those discourses. So at the South by Southwest conference, which was in April, which has always been a big deal in kind of music and arts and then in technology, and they had an education stream. So at that conference in April, these were the words that were kind of being used, and phrases that were being used again and again. Most EdTech conferences have a kind of bullshit bingo card that's given out at the beginning. So if we had one yesterday, for example, it would be duck, yellow. In education, it's MOOC, college, edupreneur, bring your own device, one-to-one, guide on the side, 21st century, all of these phrases, I mean, they're very, very popular. I mean, there are certain tropes here. So there's promises of renewal and revision and reversioning. I mean, the TVS 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, where I used to work in London Knowledge Hub, 2.0 is very kind of 10 years ago, so Web 3, Web 4. When you ask people what Web 3 and Web 4 obviously people tend to kind of glaze over. But there's all of these things. And also what I wanted to concentrate on in the chapter is this underlying kind of feeling of disruption. Technology is a disruptor, we disrupt. And this fascinates me, because disruption is a common trope amongst the kind of digirati. So if you read Wired or you take Claire Shirky seriously, digital technologies are disrupting societies. They're disrupting the newspaper industry, for example. They're disrupting the music industry. They're disrupting high street retail. Technology's been kind of positioned as this disruptive force, and I think that really needs unpacking. And it's particularly prevalent with education. So one of the key kind of gurus of this discourse is Jeff Jarvis, for example, from New York, who does all sorts of stuff. So in his book on Google, education is one of the institutions most deserving of disruption. Now that always gets quoted, but the rejoinder is having the greatest opportunities to come of it. And I guess those of you who are into microanalysis, just looking at that one particular phrase is really, really interesting. So there's a blame kind of assumption there that education deserves to be disrupted, but then there's also this idea of benevolence, and technology can actually change things for the better. So it's a really interesting sentiment. Now to the untrained, or the unfamiliar eye, this is a really challenging thing for education. If someone was saying this about you, you'd feel really threatened and you'd think, oh, what's going on here? The thing is, these discourses are now so prevalent in education technology that we just don't take any notice of them. You just, it's disruptor. And you hear everyone talking about this is the new disruptor. In the meantime, nothing really changes. We're still teaching with boards and someone's at the front, but fascinating. So it no longer registers in EdTech circles, but I think we need to kind of unpack it. So this is what I wanted to do in the chapter, and just do these general, usual questions that one asks about discourses: what's going on, what are the values, what are the underlying concepts, blah blah blah. And I think if you consider education technology and disruption and the new digital landscape in terms of these questions, then I'm arguing in the chapter anyway, there's two main themes emerge. So identify different kind of strands of this idea of disruption, what I've called reschooling and then deschooling. So I just wanted to kind of rehearse these and see whether they kind of make sense, these discourses of digital reschooling and digital deschooling. And they're all to do with the institutions of education. So I think if you think about the reschooling ones first, I hope this works, then this is all about formal education provision, but reorientating and recasting institutions and mass education in schools, universities and colleges into more fluid, individually centred, individually driven, connected, creative qualities of digital age learning. So it's kind of a substantive reconstruction of an institution, but the institution still exists. But I think the discourse here is around reconfiguring institutions in terms of time and space, expertise and novices, production and consumption of knowledge, single and simultaneous acts, asynchronous, and all of these things. Remixing and mashing up and just kind of allowing people to kind of be a bit more individual in the way they do things. And these discourses come from many, many different quarters, and I'm fascinated by the gurus, the charismatic spokespeople that kind of spruik these ideas. So in Britain, for example, we have a guy called Stephen Heckle, who's I think he probably comes to he goes anywhere where there's a kind of port and you can do sailings if you like to yachts. He's been around for a long, long time. He's very, very influential and kind of puts forward these ideas of school being completely remixed and rethought from the individual perspective. In Australia, we've got a guy called Gregor Whitley, who very modestly allows his publishers to say he's one of the greatest minds of our time. I've never heard of him, but presumably that's just my not reading enough. But I mean, Whitby rehearses a whole set of arguments about schools and technology, which are very familiar. We need a new model of schooling that isn't based around the factory, the industrial area of schools. Kids are doing it for themselves, they're digital natives, they're creating outside, and all these practices and these vernacular practices need to be brought in, and we need to not let our kids down. Similar kind of discourses you hear all around the world from different people. And on an international level as well. So Mark Prensky, who's been mentioned already, is typical for this. I'm not sure if this is a spoof Twitter account or not, because it's perfect. He just spews out Prenskyisms. In fact, he has a hashtag, Prensky Perspective. So he's now kind of, but we know the Prensky digital native stuff. Unfortunately, you can't read it because of the resolution. But anyway, not all digital natives know how to use technology well, but almost all see technology as a fundamental part of the 21st century. Technology offers far more than new ways to do old things. It brings opportunities to do blah, 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 blah. And you're kind of aware of these things. And incredibly powerful, incredibly powerful. Prensky's taken really, really seriously. And so these discourses have been perpetuated on many different levels. I mean, most recently, for example, we've got the TED Education talks, which are kind of airing on PBS. So you've got a whole range of the TED set, for example, who are promoting these ideas of rethinking institutions. Now, you may not recognise him because he's lost a lot of weight, but Bill Gates, then, for example, gave a TED talk recently where he talked about the fact that the system we have today isn't fair to teachers. We need new technologies that give tools for and he's basically arguing $5 billion needs to be spent on videos and allowing teachers to, so fair enough. You've got all sorts of people. John Legend, the musician and philanthropist, also has opinions on education, which are very similar, and there's other people there. You've got Ken Robinson. I don't know if you came across the viral video that Ken Robinson gave about rethinking. And this is a very familiar discourse. The school is an industrial technology built in the late 19th century about factory education. We need to smash this system up and rethink it for the 21st century. He talks about schools basically revolving around low-grade clerical work. It's an industrial process, a mechanistic system that isn't at all connected to the world that kids live in today. And we've got this idea of the 21st century kids who's computers, iPhones, advertising, television, and the only technology they're really being pumped for is Ritalin and pharmaceuticals, made to learn boring stuff from the teacher. Now this is all, like I say, it's so familiar, you kind of just washes over and we accept it, particularly in education technology circles. This idea of the school being a defunct technology is kind of taken as right, I think. All sorts of different organisations and values are pushing this. So SRI International, who are an interesting global group in themselves, and the International Society of Technology, this School 2 blueprint that was around in the 2000s, for example, the idea of mashing up pedagogy, curriculum 2.0, schools being places where learners can just come in and do what they want to do, and completely turning the school on its head. We've got the idea of badges, again coming back to Rodney's idea about self-quantifying, for example. The open badge movement is very, very popular now, where you can get badges and accreditation and points for learning that you do on the web. So an organisation like NASA or the Girl Guides, for example, can give a badge for you doing something online, and you can collect these badges, and then you can turn them into job opportunities, education opportunities, new privilege. I mean, it's a really interesting model of accrediting learning that takes place on the web. The flipped classroom, for example, this is another big buzzword in the last few years. The idea that we no longer have to teach like this in a lesson, all this stuff would be done online, on a video beforehand, and then we'd come to the classroom and have a real active discussion and creative kind of working with the boring stuff that you consumed at home. And this is taken really, really seriously. It's all about reschooling, rethinking the institution, flipping the classroom, open, blah, blah, blah. And it sometimes feels, I think, that this, want of a better word, this bullshit knows no bounds. I'm coming across stuff just for this talk, the idea of the rock star teacher. We come across this up here. We don't just have teachers that do boring stuff, we have rock star teachers that use flipped classrooms or MOOCs and are superstars around the world. And I was reading a description on rock star, it's a rock star camp for teachers, and you're the type of teacher that can walk down the corridor getting high fives from students and people coming up and then getting your autograph. Sal Khan is taken as the poster boy for this rock star teacher generation. The Khan Academy, I can't underestimate under stress how influential the Khan Academy is in political discourse, in even just in kind of general education discourse now. Everyone wants to know how Sal Khan is, as it says here, a new breed of disruptions is finally going to fix education. This is informed. So it's a fascinating area to be working. What really interests me about the reschooling discourses, how they're being embodied in actual tangible forms. So Apple, for example, have got a very long-running School of the Future in New York where they're testing out ideas on how to rethink the school. Microsoft, again, have a high school of the future in Philadelphia where they have designed and staffed and run a school along different learning principles. The Microsoft School of the Future is fascinating. Community collaboration, content creation, sharing content, innovative education practices. You're not a teacher or a student, you're a learning community. Maybe these are all familiar things in terms of education. What's interesting about Microsoft School of the Future is that there are two of them that exist, but it allows Microsoft to make a blueprint for other schools. So this is their competency wheel for how to hire principals and all the different competencies that the 21st century principal needs. And then these models are transported around the world. Really, really interesting. I'm becoming quite interested in the Quest to Learn school as well, which is a game. It's not necessarily a gamified school, but it's a school that's been kind of set up around the principles of game-based learning. You have a curriculum which is based around questing, for example. So the curriculum is divided into domains. You can level up instead of going up a year group. You're sent on discovery missions, and the idea is it combines intrinsic motivation, competitive sentiment, performance measurement, and metrics with the extrinsic rewards associated with play. Fair enough. Kids like games. They like learning in a kind of more game-like way. And of course, as Alana was hinting at yesterday, the idea of 21st century schools was such a common reschooling discourse over the last 10 years. It's really interesting to trace it, because I kept hearing this, 21st century schools, and I thought, what is this? Where's it come from? And if you look at the kind of history of this, it comes from lots of different places. So UNESCO had an ICT competency framework, for example, in the late 90s, which had 21st century schools. OECD had a New Millennium Learner, where they talked about 21st century competencies. Apple had a Classrooms of Tomorrow project where they identified 6 21st century, and this kind of discourse perpetuates throughout the circuits of kind of education, whereas at the end we're just thinking, yeah, 21st century, that makes sense. We kind of know they're based around the 4 C's of creating, communicating, collaborating, you know, it makes sense. And what's interesting to me is how, is that, as I say, the changes and the assumptions behind these now very, very familiar discourses. So, why are we being told this? What values underpin this? Where is this all coming from? And these are really quite critical questions. So reschooling is a big thing, but what's also really interesting is, I think, a slightly more radical idea of deschooling. And this is not as prevalent, but it is prevalent. And this is a much more radical idea of deinstitutionalisation, where digital technology completely usurps the need for the education institution. So, for example, we've got key concepts of the individual, self-determinisation, the self-organised learner, the self-regulated learner, learner autonomy, do it ourselves, which is a neat twist on do it yourself, do it ourselves. It's a kind of collective thing, but it's also a very independent thing. So this whole idea of unlearning fits very well with this, the idea of learning how to learn independently, rejecting the banking model of the school or the university, where you accumulate knowledge Instead, it's open, it's radical, it's experimental, it's sharing knowledge, it's all the stuff that we kind of, we associate with the nonsense that is often talked about in terms of digital technology in general. And there's actually a long-standing rejectionist line in education technology thinking. So Seymour Papert, which is one thing I learned, I always call him Papert, but it's paper with a T. There's long kind of advanced this idea of the computer blowing the school up or overthrowing the structure of the school, the whole MIT kind of tradition. And the idea that in the industrial era school is an anachronistic relic of the industrial age. And this follows on that. But what's interesting in the last few years is how this has been very much based around a kind of rebooting of Ivan Illich and the whole idea of deschooling from the 70s. There's kind of quite a radical oppositional framing here. And I think this is evident increasingly throughout education technology. So 1 laptop per child. I don't know if you've all been aware of the lean green machine. Nicholas Negroponte, there's a whole bunch of people behind this, but kind of again coming out of MIT and paper and all of this stuff. In some ways, it relies upon schools to be distributed, which is interesting, but the philosophy behind it is completely the opposite. It's about networked individualism, it's about the self-determining power of the individual child. And if you look at what's the 1 laptop per child group say about schools, it's very kind of anti-institution. I mean, Negroponte was ridiculed recently talking about the best way of actually getting kids to use these things is having a helicopter drop in Ethiopian villages, just dropping these things by parachute. So there's a whole load of colonialist assumptions about which we won't go down. There are about 100 million kids without schools, without access to literate adults, and I would like to explore a way to get tablets to them in a manner that does not need educators to go to the village. So just drop these things and then paper stuff, learning takes place. It's quite a radical discourse about the need for schools and et cetera, et cetera. Hole in the wall, I don't know if you've come across the hole in the wall in Sugatra Mitra. Again, minimally invasive education. You plonk a computer in an Indian slum and the kids go to it and they suddenly learn English, all sorts of stuff, just because the technology is there. And the whole idea of this is it's out of the way, out of the mind locations, minimally invasive, self-organised learning, et cetera, et cetera. And he's actually recently got the £1 million TED Prize, TED, for his latest idea, which is the school in the cloud, which is a similar kind of idea, but it's this idea that knowledgeable community members can give mentoring to learners anywhere around the world. Like this idea of a granny cloud, where grannies in the northeast of England, with time on their hands, could help educate kids in India. Self-organised learning, self-activated learning, etc., etc. This de-schooling rhetoric is really, really interesting. Without wanting to take too much of Michael's thunder away from his talk, I think the MOOC, the original MOOC ethic, was very much about deinstitutionalisation. So I'm not talking about Coursera and edX and the kind of what they call X-MOOCs, the for-profit MOOCs, which we're now talking about. But the original idea, as George Siemens and Stephen Downes and is it Dave Collier? There's always 3 of them, one always gets missed out. The original idea coming from the Canadian universities like Athabasca, easy to read, not easy to say, and print, all of that stuff was very, very radical. It was about personalised learning networks. It was about allowing people to learn anywhere they wanted, through any technology they wanted, and it would be aggregated somewhere, but it was very, very radical, very grassroots, really countercultural. And so you've got people like Downes talking about the MOOC philosophy, and this is not Coursera or edX. In place of the education institution, we create our own forms of learning through free association with each other. We cannot be abridged, cannot be held hostage, cannot be sacrificed to corporate or proprietary interests. It's interesting to see what Stephen Downes now has to say about the MOOCs, which are being kind of influenced in 2013, because he's obviously quite hostile to a lot of it. They would see themselves in a much more radical de-schooling place, and that Downes has described himself as an edupunk, and there's kind of an edupunk reaction against the commercialisation of learning, a do-it-yourself attitude, thinking and learning for yourself. I was invited recently to go to a talk on zero education, and there's a very kind of nihilistic sentiment to this, which is fascinating. So I think reschooling, deschooling, both need unpacking. They're really powerful, and they've certainly influenced the recent tone of the conversation about education. They're very seductive discourses in defining education problems, i.e. the institution, the industrial era institution, the factory institution. And they're very good at defining the solution as well, more technology, individualised technologies. So there's a seductive and very kind of convincing set of propositions about what education is and how it works, presuppositions, treating certain propositions as given, and interpersonal functions, so the relationships between people in education. Now I think it forms this kind of general common sense or orthodoxy about 21st century education, what it should be. In all of these terms, the digital reconfiguration of education is inevitable. The only question is how much we do it. And I think this is really interesting. So I think we need to unpick this loose consensus. Because when you look more closely at it, I think there are lots of differences between, don't worry, it's a blank one. Maybe I should do it kind of blank. I think when you look at it more closely, a lot of the groups that I've highlighted, I think they're not as cohesive as they may seem. There's so many different interests and agendas and conflicting ideologies behind these things that it kind of needs problematizing. And I think the messages are clear enough, but who are actually pushing these messages are really, really interesting. So again, without wishing to be too much, too kind of polarised in the way that I present things, I think there are two camps that you can kind of put people into. And again, in the chapter I tried to do this, we should see if you think it works. I think on the one hand, there are a whole bunch of actors and interests which I kind of term the educational technology community. And these are a whole bunch of different people that are pushing these ideas. So we've got just teachers who are passionate about technology. Some of them are specialised ICT teachers or computer media teachers or just interested in using technology. And you've got a whole kind of local ecology of people that kind of circle around schools and universities. I was really interested by the Moshi Monsters and the Club Penguin thing yesterday about the micro-celebrities. So you've got a micro-celebrity on Club Penguin. It's the same in EdTech. You've got local teachers that you know they're famous. They go to conferences and they give little keynotes about using game. And I know them to be quite kind of famous in my little world. And then actually, of course, they're just a teacher in a primary school in the south of England. But they're a local kind of evangelists and advisors and blah, blah, blah. There are quite powerful advocacy groups in most countries. In Britain, for example, the British Computer Society has had quite a key role in reshaping how technology is now going to be used in policy. Similarly, in America, there's an EdTech Action Network lobby group that quite powerfully lobbies the US government. You've got academics working in teacher training and education departments, and a lot of the people I hang out with are key producers of some of these discourses. The specialist research labs, MIT Media Lab, there's a whole bunch of kind of copycat. I used to work in one called the London Knowledge Lab, for example. There's the Ideas Lab in Melbourne. There's labs everywhere, one of those for the last 10 years. There's the journals and conferences and blah, blah, blah. Very interesting group of kind of non-profit, kind of social think tanks. There was one in Britain called Future Lab, who were very, very influential, and there's one in Singapore, whose name I temporarily forget. All sorts of people. Commercial R&D units, the Apple Education, the Microsoft Education, Dell Education. And then, as I said, these kind of education technology gurus. And there are policy wonks and there are rabble-rousers, but as there is in charismatic individuals that just kind of go first class around the world, sprouting these ideas. And I think what unites all of these people, all of this education technology community, is the idea that education technology is a positive project. They're trying to do these things for good. They think technology can make a positive change. It can help learning, it can free learning, they're kind of acting for good. But the de facto role then of anyone involved in education technology is to use technology for good, to harness the power of technology, as was often said in Britain in the 2000s. And this is evident in the whole discourses around education technology. So the field is often referred to in Europe, for example, as technology-enhanced learning. That's just taken as a given, that's the area we work in. And if you think about the assumptions behind that, they're really, really interesting label, isn't it? There's no doubt there that technology is playing a role in enhancing learning. Never questioned. I mean, 20 years before that, we talked about computer-assisted learning. Again, the same thing. It's a positive project. But there's no problem. I haven't got a problem with that at all. It's just interesting to see where different groups are coming from. And there are lots of values behind this kind of this area of education. And lots of people, when I've said this before to them, deny it. But I think a lot of it is about a personal passion for technology. There is just a kind of techno-fundamentalism. People love technology. They think there's something worthy about it in and of itself of using technology. There is a fear of missing out. FOMO, I don't know if you've come across that phrase. The next new technology, how the hell are we going to use it in school? iPads, what are we going to do with them? Oh, stick them in school and see what happens. Again and again and again and again. And Rob Kling talked about computationalism The idea that you can actually solve things through algorithms and computer programming and coding, the one laptop per child thing is a good example of that. One of the programmer communities in One Laptop Per Child had this motto in the 2000s of, not every child in the world has a computer. This is a bug. We will fix this. And that's a mentality which is, I think, needs to be taken seriously. There is this kind of techie code and programming kind of hacking ethos that we can solve things through code and programming and algorithms. And of course there's a whole bunch of other things. There's progressive education. I think a lot of this relates to more fundamental ideas like student-centered learning and Dewey, and all these things kind of are evoked. And also learning science. You cannot criticise Vygotsky and post-Vygotskyan theory in EdTech. It's based around this very kind of social-cultural idea of how learning takes place. And you look at the people who write about education technology, and they're doing very much so from a Vygotskian and post-Vygotskian perspective. Scandinavia, Janssen, there's all sorts of people here. In some ways, this is just a tool for social cultural ideas of learning being implemented in institutions. A Trojan mouse, as some people refer to it. It's not really about the technology, it's a way of smuggling in learning theories about learning, which fascinates me. And there's other things as well, though. I think there is a communitarian thinking. I think a lot of this relates to the 60s hippie idealism of technology. The idea that, we can kind of, the whole Earth Electronic Network movement, or whatever it was, and the whole idea that, we can kind of rethink things in a much more kind of loose, the Howard Rheingold's of the world who still wear tie-dye jackets. There's that idealism that comes there. And as I kind of hinted at before, a much more kind of radical anti-institution counterculture, hacking, activism. A lot of these people are self-styled punks or pirates, and there's this kind of, living on the edge type vibe as well. And, as I said, the critical pedagogy as well. A lot of critical pedagogy, democratic education. As I say, Ivan Illich, Paulo Freire. There is a rainbow alliance of people and values here, I think, which is quite interesting. But it is an alliance. I think these are people trying to do things for good. So that interests me. But, on the other hand, we've got people like Bill Gates. He might be, but he used to be. He likes to think he used to be a homebrew, kind of invented it all in the garage, but he certainly comes from another perspective. And this is the second group of people I was interested in. And I've tried to call them it's not me at all, the education industry complex. Now, there's a danger here. Alana was talking last night about not wanting to seem like some 16-year-old, capitalism is bad and we'll do what we can do about it. But there is another set of values I think we need to get to grips with in terms of a slightly more for-profit, slightly more commercial, slightly more industrial set of ideas. And Joel Spring and Anthony Kitiana have a really good book that's just come out about the education industry complex, and I think you can use this. It's an update of Eisenhower's military industry complex, obviously. And they define it as ideological, technophile and for-profit entities that seek to promote their beliefs, ideas, products, services in furtherance of their own goals and objectives. And this is another group of people who are also pushing these ideas of reschooling and deschooling. Lots of state government agencies. We used to have one called BECTA in Britain, which the EdTech, Office of EdTech in the Department of Education in the States. And lots of policy and economically led think tanks. So we've got the Hoover Foundation, for example, very kind of core, conservative, almost neocon ideas about markets and education, using technology as a vehicle. Education publishers. You cannot go to an education technology conference and Pearson not sponsor it. So you've got big organisations like Pearson, for example, getting involved in all sorts of things. A whole bunch of for-profit education providers. So Apollo were always kind of highlighted as, with University of Phoenix. I'm fascinated by the for-profit education providers, which are now underpinning a lot of what goes on in EdTech. Serco, for example, run a lot of the virtual learning environments in UK schools. Serco are brilliant. They're often described as the biggest company that you've never heard of. In Britain, they run the ferries, the trains, the traffic lights, the prison vans, and the learning platforms that are used in schools. And there's a whole, if you're interested in surveillance, and there's all sorts of stuff going on there. But it's a place to make a profit. It's no problem. Lots of IT industry interest, Dell, Microsoft, all the way through to local companies, and then media companies as well. News Corp have a huge EdTech arm. If you look at how New York City EdTech is organised, News Corp and their Amplify company have a big role in that. And then this more interesting idea of the venture philanthropists and the kind of foundations, the MacArthur Foundation, which sure there's lots of people here that have taken money from the MacArthur Foundation. They're big in this area. The Gates Foundation. All of this Spring refers to as a coincidence of interests. And it's a really interesting mix of a coincidence of interest as well. And actually, I think TED is a good example of where these people are coming from. TED is really interesting because, it's a TED talk. It sounds really sexy, 18 minutes, it's slick. Rachel Kendrick refers to it as chicken soup for the neoliberal soul. So there's a really interesting mixture here of kind of Silicon Valley entrepreneurialism, of cool capitalism, which is not, it's people that don't wear ties. The only person wearing a tie there is the principal of a high school, rather than a grey open neck. There's a kind of do-gooder mentality, a benign capitalism, a kind of, it's a kind of revenge of the nerds. These are not the alpha male CEOs from Wall Street. These are, trust us, kind of Richard Branson approach to capitalism. Using money for good, but still using money. And I think there's a really interesting mix of values and agendas. And I think whereas the positive project of the EdTech community was, you can look at it in 6 or 7 different ways, I think this group as well have a different range of agendas. I mean, obviously they're for profit. A lot of these people are interested in making money. The US K-12 EdTech market is worth $60 billion a year. So obviously there's money to be made here. It's not just about chasing profit. I think there is a value attached to the increased privatisation of public education. The idea that actually some school functions should be outsourced to the private sector. Why not? Private actors do have a role to play in universities and schools and everything else. There's a libertarianism as well, I think, that underpins a lot of this. The reduced role of the state. That's fair enough. What I call the economics of education, the idea that actually technology can be used to make education institutions run along more efficient lines, the kind of the smart school, the smart university. We can also improve national economic competitiveness, making Singapore the #1 information society, etc., etc. Master Plan 3, I think they're on there, which is quite impressive. Obviously, Master Plans 1 and 2 didn't work very well. And also, I'm also interested in this idea of a lot of these things being pushed for the needs of the new economy, post-industrial economy. It's often referred to as cognitive capitalism or algorithmic capitalism or immaterial labour, for example. A lot of the skills that are now being pushed in the idea of 21st century skills, for example, are the skills needed for the workplace. Group work, for example. We need people that can work with information and create and be data competent, etc., etc. What's interesting, I think this holds equally for the kind of the future creative classes, the symbolic analysts, as it does for what Mackenzie Ward calls the processing classes, the information grunts that are going to have to work just inputting data or working call centres or whatever. All of these ideas of technology disrupting education, you could argue, are linked towards the needs of the new economy. All really, really interesting. So I think there's so much to be thinking about when we talk about iPads in the classrooms. Even Guy's thing, we're starting off the conference, there's a whole bunch of stuff that's kind of at a macro level, and then all the interesting stuff at a micro level as well. And we really need to reflect on this. What interests me most is how no one ever wants to talk about it, or really acknowledge it, or even really care about it. There's such a diversity of interests, seemingly existing side by side in a consensus, that it can't be that simple. And I think a lot of this is just ideology at work. I mean, hegemony is perhaps a bit strong word to use, but it's certainly, Norm Friesen calls it ideologically charged common sense. Everyone is happy to go along with more technology in education because they're trying to make the world a better place. But they all mean something different by better. And I think that really needs problematizing, particularly in terms of those questions I put up at the beginning. What are we gaining, what are we losing? And this is what I wanted to do in the chapter. The chapter just finishes by problematizing everything I've just said. And I think there are a number of recurring values in the use of technology in education which we need to think more carefully about. I don't know if these are all of them, but I think certainly this idea of individualisation runs throughout the technology of 2013. So the idea that it's actually more the responsibility of the individual to make choices and to be responsible for the choices and to deal with the consequences of the education. So the entrepreneurial learner, self-dependence, etc., etc., and the self-responsibilisation of learning. It's very much about the individual taking responsibility for their own learning. And actually learning now is much more informal, but it's much more risky. So the success and all the failure lies more on the shoulders of the individual. Yeah, that's fine. I think education is being reframed along less collective lines. I mean, there still are communities, but I mean, looking at Rodney's communities of solipsistic white guys worried about their body mass index. I mean, it's a different type of community, isn't it? Or a different type of collective coming together, a community of me. But I think education and learning as well is also being framed more as a competitive endeavour. If not necessarily against other people, certainly against yourself. And again, Rodney's thing was fascinating, because you really are competing against yourself. You're not learning harmoniously or operating harmoniously with other people necessarily. You're trapped. Matt Allen talks about people in personal cycles, individual feedback loops, industrious self-improvers. That's fine. You know, I can go away and really geek out and learn about, I don't know, long lens photography. But it's a different type of learning than would be if I went to an evening class, for example. There's promotion of the free market values as the preferred mechanism of organising education, not necessarily for profit, and lots of markets don't have to be for profit, and there are lots of different types of market. Just rational market exchange is just a better way of organising things. Again, this commodification of learning, unbundling teaching and learning into discrete bits that can be quantified and exchanged and outsourced. And as I said, this valuing of, increased valuing of privatisation runs throughout a lot of how technology is being used. And also, I mean, Guy bolts away from talking about pedagogization. You know what I mean? This idea of expansion of education across different social bits. And I think this is key. I'm trying to find out more about Bernstein's idea of the total pedagogization of society. One of the last things he wrote about before he died. A modern society that makes sure pedagogy is integrated into all possible areas of life. And I think, again, technology kind of fits into that. And this is the last thing which I haven't quite got I can't quite say it properly, but I think there's something, I don't want to be too spiritual or too humanistic, there's something about an altered emotional state of this technology-based education. It's less immediate, less intimate, more instrumental. Alana was talking about ethics. It's a bit touchy-feely, but I think we're dehumanisation. There's something going on. There are different qualities here. I've been reading Richard Sennett talking about spiritual alienation. So where he talks about the conditions of good work become detached from the conditions of good character. The danger is as soon as you start talking about character and values, and you end up sounding a bit like a kind of religious neocon. But there's something there, I think, that needs talking about. I don't know. So anyway, so what? That's always the kind of question I ask whenever I do anything. Who cares? And actually, I think on one level, perhaps all of this is not a cause for concern at all. I haven't got a problem with markets or private companies or profit or any of this. There are lots of people, I think, who are advantaged by this, who do very well out of more individualised form of learning, more elitist form of learning. Lots of people, Rodney was looking really good, isn't it? So this idea of kind of acting in that way works for a lot of people. So in some ways, there's nothing to critique. I don't think we should be these 16-year-olds. They're all Microsoft, they're terrible. You know, it's not as easy as that. But if you are going to be a bit more socially minded or coming at things from a kind of more social justice perspective or a critical perspective, I think a lot of these values don't fit very well with perhaps the values that education has or the education technology community has, for example. There are lots of people that obviously will win from these forms of learning, but lots of people that will lose. And I think my concern is that really well-intentioned, well-meaning, disruptive, edgy, you know, these pirates and punks and everyone else are kind of legitimising a lot of values and changes to education that, I'm not saying they're not aware of it, but are taking place underneath it. So there's this argument that perhaps well-meaning educationists are having their kind of values disarticulated from the progressive things they want to achieve and re-articulated to more neoliberal, neoconservative agendas. Now, if that is the case, I think we need to recognise it and perhaps act on it. I think if we are going to, I think technology can be used for good, but I'm not sure it's being used for good at the moment, as the MOOC example shows. With the best intentions, the best technology, we end up having this thing that, you know, is making billions of dollars for lots of different corporations. So what do we do? This is a great place to make these observations, because there are no easy solutions. This is an academic paper, so I'm not coming up with any kind of solutions at all. I think first of all, the first thing we need to do is recognise that we need to get people talking about these things. I think we need to encourage a vigorous public debate, make this a site of public controversy. Because at the moment, when we talk about this, nobody cares. I've tried for the last 20 years saying this kind of stuff. No one gives a flying fig. You just don't think this way about technology and education. It seems to be really weird to critique education technology. You're either dismissed as a Luddite or a naysayer, or people just smile and say, yeah, I agree, and then carry on doing whatever it is they do. This was brought home last night. So I've written a book about this, and I've called it Distrusting Educational Technology, and it's out in November. And last night, Routledge were in that book launch, and it was great, and David sold all his books. And they gave out a flyer with a list of all the books that people in this room have written in the next year coming out. And the publishers had obviously assumed that this was a misprint. And on the leaflet, it says, distributing education technology. Which is why the hell would anyone write a book about distrusting educational technology? And I thought, if my publishers, who've actually got the bloody book in there, it's really, I don't blame them at all, because I would have thought, hang on a minute, that doesn't look right, you must have been distributing. So, that's a cheap way of me publicising, but also, I think we need to challenge these common sense and understand that education technology is a given, we need to get it in, the only way, blah, blah, blah. So on a prosaic front, I think we need to challenge this edtech speak, for example. There are other labels and terms that can be used to describe technology. It's not necessarily technology-enhanced learning. We don't all use virtual learning environments. I mean, if you just called it a kind of student control system, for example, you would approach it in a very different way. Anyway, that's me. And I think we need to make the debates in this area much more controversial, disagreeable, nasty even. It's a very cosy consensus when you go to tech conferences. Everyone kind of agrees that we're all doing good, and then we go off to the free Pearson-sponsored buffet. It's a cosy consensus, and I think it needs to be disrupted a bit. And actually, I think also academics can do better work in this area as well. I think the academic community is to blame for actually kind of going along with a lot of this, not problematizing it. Andrew Burnham talks about the need for all of us to move beyond what he calls the celebratory vagueness of much scholarly work on digital media. We talk about creativity, which is, oh yeah, what does that actually mean? And there's all sorts of stuff. We need to mess things up. So actually, I think that's what the kind of the punchline to this paper. I think we do need to genuinely disrupt education technology, but not in the ways that people talk about disruption. We need to mess things up, bring things back to these big D questions, and really think about things in terms of the politics of this. And again, I think, was it Bill Clinton that had a thing above his desk saying it's the economy stupid? But it would be good to have something that just says it's the politics stupid. I think when we think about digital education, actually when we think about digital things at all, we should be thinking about politics for the small people. Anyway, that's that.
Should do a TED talk.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'm quite a hypocrite on many different levels, so that would probably sit quite